grade was glorious, said literally no one ever. It's a time we're more gremlin than human, too old to, blatantly ignore social cues, but not quite old enough to accept cultural differences. So, when a 6th grade girl gets up and starts talking about traditional Chinese cuisine like feng chua, or chicken feet, you can imagine what the comments might be like. While the choices that 6th graders make certainly aren't the best versions of ourselves, my classmates' reactions to Chinese cuisine are indicative of how it's viewed in society. Dr. Chen Yudan, an associate professor of international relations and public affairs at Fudan University, explains how cultural aspects like cooking and eating, which are considered private and apolitical, have become ingrained in the political identities of Chinese Americans. And at a time when there is increased animosity against Asian Americans, it's not just anti-COVID or anti-Chinese rhetoric that's being spread. It's the continuation of Chinese food being used as a discriminatory weapon. By examining the historical context of Chinese food in America and its transformation over time, we can recognize its critical implications and take some steps forward to move past our preconceptions. So first, let's take a look at where some of our beloved Chinese takeout food items have worked their way into our pop culture and comfort cuisine. In the mid-1800s, we saw Chinese immigrants coming to the United States and opening up restaurants to create a sustainable source of living. However, in 1882, the United States government enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese workers from immigrating in an effort to protect white laborers' jobs, with the exception of restaurateurs and similar professions. After decades of this immigration policy, the US Congress passed the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which abolished the existing immigration quota system and opened up the gates to anyone who wished to immigrate. Working-class Chinese and Cantonese immigrants started arriving in the United States and opening up low-budget restaurants to make a living in a land that afforded them more economic freedom. However, because many of these restaurants were opened up by working-class immigrants who had little to no money to start their own businesses, these restaurants were often smaller and located in areas that were neglected. As a result, Americans started to perceive Chinese food negatively because they presumed that it was cheap and the ingredients were dirty and unsanitary. In response to the expansion of Chinese restaurants in the United States, the term Chinese restaurant syndrome emerged. It supposedly caused symptoms of dizziness and palpitations from the ingredient of MSG. But despite the fact that it was scientifically proven to have no health effects, the media continued to create a stigma around it. This purposeful misrepresentation of Chinese culture has created decades of disadvantage for Chinese immigrants and the generations that have followed. But for many working-class immigrants, opening up restaurants was the only way to integrate into society. Because of US immigration policies, immigrants were automatically looked down upon and excluded from society. But despite this bastardization, Chinese immigrants and restaurants still found a way to connect to their past by creating two menus for their customers, one with more traditional Chinese cuisine and another with more Americanized flavors. These two menus eventually morphed into one as they catered to their larger audience of Americans. The demand for Chinese food primarily came from American demographics, and this demand created fusion cuisine between Chinese and American cultures. Now, fusion cuisine is the combining and contrasting of different techniques, flavors, and ingredients into a single dish. Typical Chinese ingredients were replaced with American ones. Chinese broccoli with American broccoli, radishes with carrots, green onions with yellow onions. But this fusion cuisine creates perceptions of Chinese culture in America that affect the way future Chinese American generations view their culture in a detrimental way. But in today's more volatile racial climate, misunderstanding of Chinese culture doesn't just affect our Tuesday Chinese takeout night. It also affects the people behind the menu. During the pandemic, blames for the origins of COVID-19 fell on Chinese Americans, And as a result, we saw an increase of discrimination that took the shape of targeted economic downturn and hate crimes. This vandalism also showed in the targeted vandalisms of Chinese restaurants, a symbol of economic pride and livelihood for many Chinese Americans. Things like ramen noodle flu and kung flu were written on various establishments, and Bloomberg explains that Chinese restaurants in New York saw an overall closing rate of 94%, compared to 61% of other restaurants in the area. This xenophobia has extended far beyond petty stereotypes against Chinese takeout food, and have started to affect the way future Chinese American generations view their identity and their safety. But despite these troubling implications, we can all make a difference, no matter what culture we come from. We, as Chinese Americans, have stayed silent for far too long. The forced transformations of Chinese takeout have not only been used to make Chinese cuisine, but Chinese culture more palatable to Americans. But this generalization wouldn't have happened if Chinese immigrants hadn't stayed silent about their culture. Instead of setting a precedent of outwardly sharing our heritage, there have been patterns of a hidden Chinese culture only shown amongst our families. We have maintained an image catered to appease Americans and kept our silence even when public opinion was wrong. To be clear, I was brought up in a home that taught me to be proud about my culture. But I was not innately put in a position to speak up and speak out about it, and I suspect this is the same for many other Chinese Americans as well. This needs to change. We, as Chinese Americans, demand the respect that our culture deserves, but to do this, we need to be more open instead of isolated. We need to break out of the mold of the model minority and speak up when we witness misunderstandings about our culture. And this can start with our food. While there are certainly staples of Chinese American food that are delicious, trust me, I'm a sucker for General Tso's myself. There are certainly traditional dishes that you will never see on a restaurant menu. Dishes like mai sangsu, which is a rice noodle and pork dish that literally translates to ants climbing up a tree. It's a personal favorite of mine because I love explaining its translation to people, but I also love telling people how I learned how to cook it by watching my mom. If we start to share our culture more publicly, we can start to bridge the divide between what we consider Chinese and American culture. Because the sad reality is, Chinese culture is not well known in America. Pew Research Center recently conducted a study where they asked Americans the question, what is the first thing you think about when you think about China? The people and country's long history and culture were noticeably absent from their responses, where instead worries about China's government and economy were ranked among the first responses. Americans are more worried about how China might pose a threat, rather than a potential for a rich and diverse culture. If we shared our customs more publicly, we could create an atmosphere for Chinese Americans that blends a diverse society. If we start to share our food more publicly, we can start to create commonalities between different cultures around America and find unique ways to connect in which we have never explored before. But as Americans, we need to be better about acknowledging the transformations of different cultures. Because when we try a cuisine we're not familiar with, we need to take the time to trace its history. It's simple and it won't take much of your time. Go to a local restaurant, order what you think sounds good. But if you're unfamiliar with the cuisine, take the time to do a simple Google search and trace a dish's origins. You can honor a dish's historic authenticity by taking the time to discover its background. The beauty is, you can open yourself to cultural empathy. The beauty of fusion cuisine is that once you discover a dish's background, you can start to draw parallels between your culture and others. It starts to bridge the divide between what we consider my culture and their culture. But this doesn't just have to be for Chinese Americans. This can be for every cultural tradition around the world. Our isolationist tendencies are not a singularity, but a common theme throughout minority groups around the nation. As a person who is both Chinese and American, I witness both sides of our shortcomings, and I see how our solutions can be beneficial to our lives today. I encourage everyone here today who is part of a minority group or community to speak up and speak out about your culture, about your traditions, about your way of life. Because your identity should be more than just a label or a stereotype. But it's also about maintaining a curiosity for the worlds around you, because we should find those connections that are beyond a biological one, but instead reach a deeper, more personal and vulnerable level. Those are the most important connections that we know. Today's solutions are a step forward in trying to fix a mindset that tells immigrants to bear the brunt of discrimination, but allows Americans to remain obtuse about the diversity that surrounds them. So, while the diets of sixth graders don't transcend dino nuggets and chocolate milk, my palate today is far more sophisticated and appreciative of Chinese American cuisine. By embracing the food of my culture, I found a way to accept all parts of my Chinese and American identity and share them with the world today. While there is a stigma around culturally different foods, if we start by learning and trying different cuisines, we can normalize the celebration of diverse cultures. And in the end, that's the immigrant's dream. Not the American dream per se, but a place where they can share who they are and where they're from in an integrative and collaborative way. Thank you.